All right, all right. And welcome back, you guys, to the Self Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hagman. Thank you for being here. Uh, this is now the second round of this episode because, believe it or not, I recorded the first one, first take. I had to shake off some recording rust, go to offload the footage, and in the midst of making room on my laptop, I ended up deleting the audio file. So that's what kind of day I'm having. And you know what? It was good. It was a good first take. I think I can do it better a second time. So we are just going to dive right in. I got a good topic today. And this was inspired largely by the post I put up yesterday. So this week for the Self-Selecting Podcast, perimenopause, amenorrhea, and ovulation. And I put up a teaser clip on Instagram. And in this, it got me fired up again because I'd kind of forgotten about this one situation with a consultation client where she came to me and she was put on Anavar for perimenopause. And it was like wild how this even happened or how she even explained it. She's like, yeah, I'm on HRT. I'm like, cool. What kind? Like TRT, estradiol, progesterone. She's like, no, I'm on Anavar. I'm like, not HRT. And it occurred to me at that moment, I was like, oh my gosh, this is happening time and time again. Like women are going to a provider of some sort, whether that be public or private. They're going in, they're complaining of symptoms of menopause or a menopause-like symptoms. Maybe they're getting labs done, maybe they're not. And in some instances, they're being put on anabolics and not on anabolics for hey, let's do a cycle to get you ready for your show. But they're being put on anabolics the way some people are being put on TRT, as corrective therapy. And it's baffling. And I'd be lying if I said that was an isolated instance where, it happened to just this one person. I've had that happen where women have complained of low libido, just poor overall drive and motivation. And seemingly enough, is pretty easy to get an Anavar prescription. Yet there was mismanagement. They weren't being monitored even after the fact. And when I put this up, it really it kind of struck me again. I don't know, it restarted a fire I have about this topic specifically. So I ended up listing out 10 things that horrify me, that just make me go crazy about, the female endocrine space, the fitness space. Even when we look at the public sector versus the private sector and how we have such a high prevalence of, these wellness clinics and spas. And even though that's great in theory, what I see a lot of is really the capitalization on the consumer being so ignorant and ultimately just be given this inventory list being told, yeah, all these things could, theoretically help you out. And it's wild. It's so sad, but that is my reality. That's what I live in, because I speak to these clients almost every single day where someone's care, their actual health, was, mismanaged to say the least. So that's what we're talking about today is your doctor, or coach, are they making any of these 10 mistakes? And it's not to say that every doctor is bad. I'm not of that belief by any means. It's not to say that you shouldn't work with a clinic or that you should fire your coach. But there are a lot of individuals that work outside their scope. And I'll just be super clear. This isn't about being licensed or being formally educated. It's just a matter of in the presence of someone who is suffering and who's symptomatic and they are trying to seek care. There are a lot of instances where people's health is being mismanaged. So I want to bring awareness to that. I want to hopefully give you some food for thought, give you the tools so that if this is you, if any of this resonates, you can be like, yeah, I got to call my doctor. I got to talk to my coach. I have some questions. And hopefully from this, you can feel a little more empowered, a little more informed, and you can make better decisions if, right now you are, I don't know, trying to find resolution or an improvement in your health. So diving right in, first mistake number 1, prescribing wild doses of TRT. Now, the number that stands out to me that's if someone comes to me and is like, I started TRT, and they tell me that they started at 20 milligrams a week, immediately, that is a red flag. That tells me that the person that recommended that, the provider, has no concept of realistically how much testosterone, how much of the drug a female needs to achieve normal to normal high levels, or they don't understand the fact that testosterone in itself can be very androgenic. Its anabolic to androgenic ratio is actually quite similar. So, especially with this drug, even though there are lots of benefits in the fact that we can measure it in blood values, we need to be careful and respect the fact that too much will almost guarantee that you do develop unwanted androgenic masculine effects. So, what is a good starting dose? I always am going to lean on the more conservative side, which some people, they'll scrutinize that and they'll be like, well, you want someone to feel better, right? Why would you not give them something that makes them feel better? And I'm going to get into that today. But first and foremost, you need to titrate up, not down. And realistically, I can tell you I've had a ton of people come to me who are on some form of TRT, whether that be injections, creams, pellets, and it's specifically for injections. If we're talking about an individual who is starting over 10 milligrams a week, it's more than likely, I can almost guarantee that individual is going to be past that, I would say, theoretical ceiling of 100 nanograms per deciliter. That's the range in which I don't really want to surpass. But for some people, 80, 90, 100, that still might be too aggressive. And that's where we really need to assess, what does this dose do for the individual? What are the improvements? So if we don't have a baseline as far as like, what is this individual experiencing? We can't really measure, has there been an improvement? But realistically, we need to start them at a dose that they can tolerate. We shouldn't be starting TRT and then immediately combating side effects. That's an indication that the dose is too high. Now, the highest dose that I've seen someone come to me with, they were on 50 milligrams a week. They had just taken a shot a few days before. They found my information. They brought their boyfriend, who was also the coach at the time, on the call with them. Their boyfriend was the one saying, like, yeah, like I take 500 milligrams a week, so I didn't think it'd be a big deal if she took 50 milligrams a week. In a lot of cases, I don't think that people misprescribing or, I don't know, misrecommending, I don't think that it's out of malice. I don't think it's because they're trying to hurt the individual. But that's where we need to be so crystal clear and on the same page that too high of a dose of testosterone in most women for a sustained period of time is more than likely going to result in irreversible effects. That's where we need to be really careful about this, and we need to understand what we're getting into when starting something like TRT. Realistically, starting at 3.5 to 5 milligrams as your starting point, and then getting an idea of your peak level. That's what I would recommend for most people. There are some people who start at 10 milligrams. And I'll say more often than not, individuals who start there, I tend to see their labs come back above 100 nanograms per deciliter. However, for some people, it doesn't actually take them into that super physiological range. Still, we need to be on the lookout for superficial changes such as acne or hair growth, because realistically, if you're on TRT, you're probably going to be on it for a good period of time, if not potentially even the rest of your life. And the longer that you're using it, the longer that you're at a dose that is too high for you, the greater likelihood that these symptoms, that these expected effects will be exacerbated. If the dose you're at is working for you, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go up. There's going to be a point where it's too aggressive and you begin to experience symptoms. So realistically, yeah, we can kind of project this based on varying degrees of lab work, but we want to find that sweet spot where you are not symptomatic and you're seeing an improvement in whatever symptoms led you to start TRT to begin with. Number 2, blanketly prescribing estrogen modulators without actually checking your estradiol levels. Now, largely this is something that I see in the sport of bodybuilding, but I've also seen this with recreational athletes, individuals who are not getting on stage, who are not trying to get super lean. And this typically happens in the case of a recreational athlete because the athlete themselves is self-reporting that they're holding a little bit of water, that they feel that PMS and they feel a little emotionally volatile. In the case of bodybuilding, this is typically taking place on account of someone who's trying to get stupid lean, and they're finding that realistically, they might not have the muscle that they need to. So, in order to get those really deep, really hard, those crispy lines, their coach is probably of the belief that their estrogen's too high, and that's actually why they're not able to get as conditioned in that low body fat and that look that they're after. Now, here's where that idea just kind of falls apart, that belief. It is very common in our space to see girls use estrogen modulators, so dim calcium glucarate, which are both over the counter, but in a lot of cases, people will even use SERMs or AIs, so things that are much stronger that will reduce activity at the receptor site or decrease that aromatization of testosterone into estrogen. Now, why does this belief fall apart? So, in the state of contest prep, you are probably not producing enough estrogen to begin with. A lot of people are not getting labs done, and it's not even necessarily to say like you should be getting a ton of panels done when you're in prep. But the ones that I've seen and a lot of individuals report feeling the symptoms of low estrogen, and then the labs, if we actually go through withdrawing them close to contest prep, we do tend to see that people are in a very suppressed state relative to estrogen and usually progesterone as well. This corresponds with being in a severe state of energy restriction. Now, if that's the case, what is the sense of putting in something that's going to continue to lower estrogen or, even break it down into weaker forms if there isn't really estrogen to do that with? So it is a little bit of bodybuilding lore, bro lore, where coaches will be like, well, this girl looked really good when we did this. Here's how it worked. I think in a lot of cases, it's very novel. It's very overhyped. I've used estrogen modulators in prep, and I've also done preps without them, and I've gotten even leaner without them. It's not to say that they impeded my ability to get lean. It's just more so to highlight and really underscore the fact that they aren't magic. You can get ridiculously lean, inside out lean. I have gotten too lean for bikini without them. So if you're of that belief that like, hey, this is actually what's impeding me bringing that super shredded, super crisp look, I can tell you if it was, then there probably would be more of an urge on my part to use them. That's not the case. And specifically in the state of contest prep, there isn't a lot to really even suppress. But really, the point of this mistake, or really the mistake I see being made, is not even that they're being used. It's that they're being used without actually checking estradiol levels. So I have a client right now who's getting ready for a show, and we both agree, we're like, your lines don't seem quite as deep as they did previous preps. And previous preps, we haven't used estrogen modulators. This prep, we're not using one. But about 6 weeks out, I asked her, I'm like, let's just get your estradiol levels checked. Let's just take a look to make sure that isn't something that we need to monitor. Lo and behold, her levels came back sub 30. So realistically, through getting labs done, we were able to confirm, like, even if we were to use an estrogen modulator, that in itself doesn't really have much to modulate. That isn't the issue at hand. Number 3, prescribing Anavar with no clear or definitive endpoint. Like I said at the beginning, this is something that I've seen people opt into as a quick fix for perimenopause, for those actually going through menopause. And it's really sad because when you look at it, it's like we're not acknowledging the fact that introducing Anavar already poses that risk of androgenic activity. But then on top of that, it's going to have suppressive effects across all sex hormones, which realistically, if you are going through menopause, if you're going through those early phases of perimenopause, then this is only going to exacerbate that and make it worse. Yet, when we look at the actual mistake and we zoom out, okay, the drug itself, not the best choice. But then also this idea that like, okay, this individual is just going to have this in indefinitely. That I have a problem with. And this is where I think a lot of people, they misunderstand the application of Anavar, and they oftentimes assume that because so many people use it or because they've used it in the past, that it is safe. And really, we have to look at this more like a cumulative load over someone's lifetime. I like to think about it kind of like a video game where you have a little life bar above your head, except we can't see how many lives you have left. We can't see how many cycles and how much total exposure to these drugs you can take and expose yourself to before things start to change. Now, the other part to this is we really have to consider too that the degree in which we can like clinically define someone has virilized. We can look at someone's voice. We can assess clitoral megaly. We can look at acne. We can look at hair growth. Sure, there are notes about like facial changes, but I see that less and less in the demographic that I'm talking about. But realistically, this is very dependent on what the individual defines as feminine as their baseline and what's important to them versus that difference in what then has occurred now using the drug. So, for instance, like if someone, let's say, their voice is very high and you would actually look at the pitch itself, and that individual, if they feel like, okay, they don't really care if their voice gets a little bit lower, like no one's really going to notice, they might have more, I would say, androgenic runway before things are very clear cut, like, hey, I virilized. This isn't universal though. And how you define femininity is very specific to you. It's very individualized. So we can't just go off this idea that, like, well, I'm only using 2.5, so I can use it a little bit longer. And if it didn't change me last time, if I didn't incur any unwanted effects, then that means I'm safe to use it for the same amount of time this next go round. Eventually, there's going to be a point that things do start to change. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen progressively. And this is where it's so important to monitor for changes and to be just very diligent if you are using an anabolic like Anavar, and understanding that this isn't something that's used as supportive therapy like TRT or like HRT. We need to have it in place only as needed and only for the necessary amount of time, if at all. Now, this next one really gets to me, and I'll tell you a story. So, I had a client come to me. He was struggling to lose body fat. He had worked with a coach before, but he's like, the biggest difference that I've made in working with a coach, now looking to hire a different coach, is I started working with a very well-known, bigger online HRT clinic. And he'd been working with them for 3 to 4 months. And I asked him, like, okay, so, you have all these drugs in place. What was really the thought process? Like, what did your provider actually walk you through? And in this case, he laid out, he's like, well, I met with the practitioner, the individual who I believe was a nurse practitioner. And then from there, I was kind of passed off to their wellness specialist. And I was told this would be my point of contact if I had any questions about the drugs, if there was anything I wanted to add or remove, if I wanted to schedule lab work, they would be my point of contact. And I really wouldn't need to meet with that nurse practitioner unless something with my health status vastly changed. So interesting. I had never really heard about the company he was working with. This was like one of my first accounts. I had heard of them, but this was my first, I would say, instance where like I was getting a customer's perspective. So basically, he met with the wellness specialist and they told him, they're like, hey, based on what your provider said, here are all the drugs that potentially we could put in place. Based on your labs, here are the things that I think would be most helpful. And essentially, he just was given a price sheet. So realistically, I was like, hey, can I see this price sheet? Like, can you send it to me? And he forwarded it over. And I kid you not, like for this guy's goals, he wanted to lose fat, he wanted to get stronger in the gym. There were probably over 30 options that he could essentially add on to his stack. And this really kind of brings me to the fourth mistake, which is combining multiple drugs that actually counteract what the other one does. So in this case, this guy was on MK677 as well as a GLP-1. And it's not super important for you to know mechanistically and everything about these drugs, but essentially the first one, MK677, it's a ghrelin agonist and it would make him hungrier. And then the GLP-1 was intended to delay gastric emptying to decrease hunger. Now, GLP-1s are very expensive, and because he was going through a clinic, the MK677 was also pretty expensive. And his wellness specialist just told him, yeah, you can put both of these in place. I think it would make sense with your goals. And it's something that I can tell you, I have found a lot of turbulence with myself because knowing that a lot of business models for these companies are structured in a way where that middleman, that person who is a point of contact, oftentimes does get paid out by how much you actually order, how much you're prescribed. That really doesn't sit right with me. And it makes it, I would say, really hard even on the employee too. And I say this given like I've worked with a girl who did very well at one of the top wellness clinics, the online services. And she would tell me that her sales manager was on her each month. And even though she would sell more each month the focus was on upping the numbers from the previous month. And he would even encourage her. He's like, if this client has any goals around weight loss, you can put them on the GLP-1. You can actually modify the pharmacy in which they go to and tell them that this pharmacy is out of stock and that they have to go with the more expensive pharmacy. And it's not to say that every clinic does this. It's not to say that every person in this position is operating unethically. But I do think that we have to honor the reality that it's a commission-based job and it is sales-based. And with the pressure of someone in a higher position telling you that your job security is based on how much you sell, this creates a lot of potentiation to abuse that system. And specifically when we're looking at these individuals who might not have the same qualifications as one another or might not meet a general standard of what they should know in terms of physiology and specifically endocrinology, this is a point of concern. So it's not to say, hey, you need to go UG or you need to fire your clinic. But I'd be very curious if you dug a little bit deeper, if you asked the individual that you're working with how they're actually getting paid out. If that's something they were to disclose to you, I'd be very curious if it wasn't a commission-based position, especially if your experience with this kind of clinic, this kind of business has been similar to the client that I worked with, where he was essentially just given the price sheet and told, pick what you want. Number 5, using estrogen modulators alongside estradiol in the form of HRT. So I've had this happen a handful of times and it really irks me. When someone's given HRT for estradiol, like a cream or a patch in order to support their estradiol levels, the idea is that they want those levels to go up. Uh, Giving someone something that modulates estrogen in terms of bringing it down, like a DIM, tamoxifen, or letrozole, these are also ones that quite literally do the opposite of what the estradiol HRT is doing. A lot of individuals are put on these kind of protocols, and it really begs the question, what was the thought process behind this? Are we trying to lower it or are we trying to raise it? I get in a quick pinch, if someone needs to lower their estrogen because it is way too high, you can absolutely use something like DIM or calcium glucarate. But realistically, we still need labs to support that. What doesn't make a lot of sense is in the case where someone is simultaneously trying to lower it and raise it at the same time. And realistically, I've seen this where individuals are just told that part of your daily supplement routine needs to be DIM or calcium glucarate, despite already having low levels of estrogen. This is why, even if you're using something over the counter, we should be really clear, really well versed on what specific hormones is it going to affect and what are those effects going to manifest as. I may have said number 6, number 5. This is number 6, not establishing an upper threshold for safe testosterone levels. So a lot of people will wind up, going to a clinic, going to their provider and telling them that, I don't feel as good as I used to. It's harder to build muscle. It's harder to lose fat. My energy's not there. My libido's lower. And, I think it's amazing to be able to have access to get some kind of support specifically for female hormonal imbalances. But it's not enough to just go off symptoms. We need to have that quantitative threshold and really have a clear understanding as to how high should we push this person. And this kind of goes in line with the first mistake, but realistically, I think we also need to respect the fact that without these labs, we have no idea how high a specific dose is taking someone. I'll tell you a story. I've had 3 girls over the last 2 years who've come to me who've been at super physiological testosterone levels. So their levels have been over 300 nanograms per deciliter. And they've told me, well, yeah, like I'm noticing some clitoromegaly. My voice is changing a little bit, but frankly, I really like how I feel. So I'm going to stay at this dose. And across all of these instances, I have expressed that it's not something that I'm comfortable overseeing or really even being a part of, largely because I can't really define what's the point in which those changes are going to be problematic or not going to be okay anymore. And realistically, that's how I approach helping anyone with managing their hormones, managing their hormone therapy is really considering that like this person might say that they're okay with these effects now. They might actually say they don't care if they get worse, but I can't control if someone's going to have a change of heart. And I certainly don't want to be enabling or be responsible for someone who down the line looks back and has regret about their hormone therapy. Realistically, if you're going to sit in a super physiological range, it is very likely that you're going to develop masculine androgenic effects. And the degree in which these happen is very person dependent. I can't outline and say, okay, after 5 years at being at 200 nanograms per deciliter, your voice is going to go down so many pitches. It's really, it really doesn't work like that. Now, another major issue is that it's not enough to just know generally what your serum levels are at. We need to be really clear that we have a clear objective concept of what is your peak level at, meaning we need to measure 24 hours to 48 hours after your last injection. A lot of times I'll get clients who come to me who their provider has recommended that they measure the trough, or let's say the lowest point in which their levels reach, and it's typically before their next injection. Now, although this could be helpful if someone is still symptomatic, if they're still low energy, lower libido, or we're potentially wanting to titrate up. However, in terms of protecting them from excess androgen activity and making sure that they're not superseding that level of 100 nanograms per deciliter, it's vastly important that initially that we're checking that peak. So regardless of how many times you're injecting, make sure that you are getting lab work done 24 to 48 hours after your last injection if you're trying to get a sense of your peak levels. And number 7, starting TRT and not scheduling a follow-up, not wanting you to come in for anywhere upwards of 4 months. And this is one I can tell you, it makes me cringe so much because essentially they just put you on a drug, sent you on your way, and are just giving you the thumbs up like, hey, let me know if anything changes. But there isn't a lot of care or management taking place. So, like I've said 1,000 times now, we really need to be clear as to how high your testosterone levels are getting if you're using exogenous testosterone. So it takes about 5 half-lives for your testosterone levels to stabilize. So, meaning if you start TRT, it's not something that I would necessarily go get tested again for a week after starting. I wouldn't try to check your lab work and see, okay, how high did they get until roughly that 4 to 6 week mark. Now, a lot of times, it's sad, but I have heard of providers just telling a client, well, unless anything is like really wrong, then you probably don't need to come in for a bit. And this is where I think a lot of healthcare really falls short, specific to females on HRT. We shouldn't be reacting to symptoms occurring. We should gather as much information while we can to ensure that that individual is in a range that we can assume is not going to cause adverse effects. So realistically, even if the individual is asymptomatic, they're not having signs of excess acne, vocal deepening, hair growth, clitoromegaly, we still don't want to continue to roll the dice and have them sit at a super physiological level. So on the flip side, how often should you be getting levels checked once you start TRT? So 4 to 6 weeks after you start, I think is an absolute must. Past that, though, if the dose is adequate and you are not symptomatic, if there are no changes in how you're doing and how you're feeling in a positive light, meaning there are no adverse effects, then realistically, we could see how it plays out. We could wait another 2, 3 months to get your next panel done just to double check things. But What really irks me is that some clinics will lock you into seeing them either monthly, bi-monthly, and force you into paying for $200 to $300 panels that might not actually be necessary. This is where, if you are going to sign a contract and you are going to opt for a longer term arrangement with your provider, I would be very clear as to what the requirements are for you to do lab work, for you to come in and actually do an in-person visit, because oftentimes this is where they're making money. And I'm all for lab work. I'm all for having the necessary information, but we can't forget the fact that these things can get very extensive. And if having these labs isn't going to change the approach and is not actually indicated, then we really have to question why we're getting them done. And I'll just say, as a bonus to this, in the case that you are trying a different bottle, if you are moving from one bottle to the next of testosterone, if you are trying a different carrying oil, if you're trying a different dose, at any point that you are changing, you should retest your labs about 5 weeks after. These carrying oils can degrade at different speeds, and it's something that, even if you feel like your dose is appropriate, it doesn't hurt to check quarterly where your levels are at. And I think it's generally just good practice to keep a pulse on your total serum testosterone levels if using TRT. All right, number 8, using hormonal birth control, whether that be a combination pill or an IUD, as a catch-all solution for cycle irregularity and PMS. So, why this irks me is that hormonal birth control, these are not the same types of hormones as estradiol and progesterone that you're given when you start HRT. With hormonal birth control, these are synthetic forms, meaning they're much stronger and oftentimes have a slew of adverse effects and can really wreak havoc on other sex hormones as a whole. Now, bioidentical hormones that are typically used in the form of HRT, they respond at the receptor completely differently. Now, it's very common. The generation I grew up in, it was not abnormal to go to your doctor, tell them that you're having irregularities in your period, you're experiencing PMS, you're experiencing bad cramps, and to be told, well, let's try a combination pill. And we can just try this until you lose your period. And then from there, we know we found the right one. Realistically, if we look at what the cessation of getting a period actually means, it means that you're not ovulating. It means that we are self-castrating or shutting our reproductive system down. And even if someone's like, well, I don't care about having kids, I don't need to family plan, we still have to zoom out and really think about the role that these sex hormones have in day-to-day life and overall well-being and physiological function. Even if reproduction is not in the cards for you or it's not something you desire, using reproductive function as kind of your North Star to assess your overall health is really wise. And it's something that I think a lot of people, they almost look at hormonal birth control as a get out of jail free card to not have a period. And, to their credit, doctors push this. And it's not just girls earlier in life, in their teens or in their young 20s. I have a lot of clients who are put on hormonal birth control later in life, and they find that the rationalization was, well, yeah, your periods were really bad, so why wouldn't we put you on a combination pill? To me, it is crucial, paramount that we understand why you're having irregularity in your cycles. And typically, this is something that we can confirm with lab work. So, as much as you might flirt with the idea of not getting a period, trust me, I get it. It is something that we need to think very carefully about. Number 9, marketing menstrual cycle cessation as a benefit to upsell hormonal birth control. This one really, really bumps me out. And I've had 2 IUDs. I just had my second copper IUD put in this past year. And this is the first time I can honestly say I've had an OB that's advocated for my health, advocated for reproductive function, and been very supportive of me sticking with a copper IUD. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, a copper IUD is non-hormonal, and it's one of the few non-hormonal forms that we have access to. So in the past, when I've gone to get my annual woman's exam or when I've gone to have my IUD checked, almost exclusively, I've had doctors try to push me towards getting it removed and switching to a hormonal IUD. Now, something that's really concerning is that even in the informed consent, when you look at hormonal forms of IUDs or combination pills, there's a section in which there is pretty ambiguous vernacular around cycle cessation, and it's in bold. It's very much phrased as if this is how we know it's working. And I can remember looking at the informed consent when I had this IUD put in place, and I realized that, like, okay, knowing what I know, I can see that and be like, hey, like cessation of my period, that means that I am not having an ovulatory cycle. That absolutely will impact potential fertility down the line. But if someone doesn't know this, and if someone like myself is pretty over having a period each month, then realistically, that's going to read as if that's an actual benefit or a perk of going with a hormonal route. I think we have to be really careful about glamorizing, romanticizing missing your period, especially in the fitness culture. It's something that a lot of women will say, well, I kind of enjoy when it goes away when I'm close to contest prep, or even when I'm in the off season, I see how long I can go without it before it returns. And realistically, I think this largely misinforms, but it also shows a level of ignorance around the importance of having adequate circulating hormone levels and how this potentially can affect not just reproductive function, but also physique outcomes. All right, last but not least, overlooking the importance of timing, getting your estradiol and progesterone checked relative to your last period. So this is something I see constantly because I do one-time consultations for individuals who already have coaches, and they come to me with lab work. They're like, hey, I want to see, how I'm actually doing. My coach doesn't really do this part of it. And a conversation that happens early on is relative to day one of your last period, when were these drawn? Now, why I ask this is because estradiol and progesterone, as well as other sex hormones, they fluctuate throughout the month, and that is indicative of healthy ovulation. A lack of fluctuation is actually a sign that you could be suppressed, you could have insufficient production, but it's also important, especially if we're comparing the ratio of estradiol to progesterone, that we understand whether or not one is too high or too low. Now, why we need to know what time of the month, like what day of your cycle, meaning day one being the first day of your bleed, and then just counting upwards from there. Why we need to know this is because early on, we have the follicular phase, then we have the luteal, we have ovulation right in the middle. If someone's levels are low in the luteal phase as opposed to the follicular, if they're low in the luteal, then the treatment or the response is going to be much different than, let's say, if they're low at the time of ovulation or if they're low during the follicular phase. It's really important when you get labs done to get them done after ovulation. Typically, it's day 21 to day 24, or about 7 to 10 days before your period. That way, we're capturing that second rise of estradiol alongside a rise of progesterone. Without that rise in progesterone, even if you have a period, it doesn't necessarily mean you're ovulating. And if we're using ovulation as our North Star to really assess for female reproductive health and globally overall health, then it's so important that we're capturing these rises simultaneously. Now, yeah, if you're irregular, like it could be harder to time, but realistically, if we're trying to capture whether or not you're ovulating, getting your labs done while you're bleeding or immediately post-bleed or pre-ovulation, it's not going to nearly be as useful as it would be if we captured it 7 days before your period. If you're not tracking your cycle, this is a really good starting point. Now, personally, I use an app called Flow. This allows you to establish trends, patterns. It gives you options to even log symptoms and physical changes. I think it's a great app. It is paid. I think it's $20 a month, but I can tell you it is pretty spot on in predicting future cycles as well. So there you have it. All in all, I don't think that many of these mistakes are made out of malice. I think typically they come from ignorance. And I think this hopefully can put you in a better position where you can ask more questions, you can be more informed, and you can have a little more agency over managing your healthcare. But if you have seen any of these red flags, if any of these mistakes sound uncomfortably familiar, let me know what questions you wish you'd asked sooner. Let me know in the comments below. Let me know what you think. As always, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.